living through one of the strangest relationship environments in modern history, and nobody is really analyzing this honestly. Because when you compare what people say they want with what's actually happening, something doesn't add up. Fewer relationships are forming, marriage is happening later than ever, fertility is falling across most of the developed world, loneliness, particularly among men, is rising fast enough that public health officials are now treating this as a serious health risk rather than a private emotion. Sexual inactivity, specifically amongst young men, has risen substantially over the last 2 decades, and birth rates across most of the developed world have fallen well below replacement. So let's be clear about this picture. Fewer relationships, later commitment, less sex, more confusion, more resentment, and more ideological conflict between the sexes. Whatever system that we're operating in right now is not producing stable relational outcomes. And when outcomes and narratives diverge this sharply, the responsible question isn't who's the villain or who can we blame. The responsible question is which system is producing these results. Because modern dating isn't just a collection of individual choices. It's a social system. And systems don't suddenly destabilize because individuals got worse. They destabilize when incentives break, feedback gets distorted, and participation stops making sense for the people inside of them. And that is where we are now. Every functioning social system depends on one core ingredient: mutual buy-in from its participants. Not perfection, not fairness, just enough belief in its legitimacy that people continue to participate in it. The moment that that belief begins to erode quietly, systems don't collapse overnight. They destabilize slowly. Participation declines, trust weakens, incentives stop aligning, and eventually people stop investing in outcomes that they don't believe they can achieve. And that's where modern dating is now. What we are witnessing is not simply tension between men and women. We are witnessing a growing number of men doing something far more destabilizing than simply complaining. They are collectively withdrawing belief in the system altogether, not protesting, not revolting, withdrawing. And withdrawing is more destabilizing to a system than rebellion. Because rebellion, well, that's still engagement. It can be negotiated, confronted, argued with. Withdrawal cannot. When enough men quietly reduce participation or participate only minimally, the system loses the behavioral energy that it was built to depend on. Now, let me set the analytical frame of this video clearly. This is not some moral lecture. This is a systems analysis. We're looking at the incentives, not the intentions, the actual outcomes, not the narratives, and the actual structural realities, not some ideological comfort. Because unfortunately, systems don't respond to how we feel about them. They respond to what people do inside of them. And behavior follows incentives so much more than it follows some arbitrary ideal. So here's what people are missing and what I need you to understand. Modern dating isn't failing because men and women collectively just suddenly got worse. It's failing because the system in itself has lost coherence. And the cleanest signal of that loss of coherence is this: men are not just frustrated, they're increasingly disengaging. And when male participation declines in a heterosexual dating system, uncertainty rises for everyone. Ambiguity expands, trust weakens, commitment delays, and guardedness increases. And you're probably already seeing these symptoms. More situationships, longer undefined relationships, delayed commitment, more distrust, more hedging against risk, and ultimately, more emotional volatility. That is not liberation. That is a system that's drifting towards a very low trust equilibrium. And once a system that is built on relationships trends towards low trust, every participant becomes more defensive, even those who genuinely want partnership. Now, I know there's a lot of people who are talking about this, but this isn't just another commentary piece. This is measurable, and the trends are real. There is widely cited survey data that shows a huge asymmetry. Roughly 63% of men under the age of 30 are single, compared with about 34% of women in this same age group. That gap is not trivial. It implies a concentration of pairing, where a smaller subset of men is pairing with a larger subset of women, leaving many men outside of stable relationship pathways. Marriage is also occurring later and less frequently. The median age for men at this point in time sits roughly around the age of 30 for their first marriage, and roughly 28 to 29 for women. This is the highest on record. Now, later marriage isn't inherently negative, but extended time in uncertain and unpredictable relational environments, well, that changes the dynamics of these interactions and ultimately behavior. It increases uncertainty, comparison, risk exposure, and distrust. Sexual inactivity amongst young men has also risen significantly. In some data sets, roughly 1 in 3 men have experienced no sexual activity in the last year. And at the same time, loneliness has become such a health risk that the US Surgeon General is now talking about this. And we're already seeing the consequences of all of this with lower birth rates and fertility issues. Now, interpretations, they'll vary, but the directional trend is pretty clear. Stable pair bonding and family formation are becoming way less common and much more delayed. And this strain is not only for men. Young women report record levels of anxiety, sadness, and relational uncertainty, where social media and comparison culture continue to play a very large role in that. So both sexes are showing signs of strain, and how that strain manifests is different. While men, they'll become silent, withdraw, and disengage. Women become hypervigilant and anxious. And that is a byproduct of what happens when a system becomes highly uncertain. Now, systems don't remain stable because outcomes are consistently good. We know, especially in relationships, that's not the case. And up until this point, dating, relationship dynamics have stayed relatively consistent over the past decade because of narratives, encouragement, social pressure, and expectations. Because every single social system runs a similar story. What's normal, what's desirable, what's progressive, what's toxic, and what needs to change. And for years, the dominant narrative has placed male behavior as the primary thing that needs an adjustment. Men need to communicate more. Men need to commit. Men need to improve. Men need to become emotionally fluent. And to be fair, some of that is valid, but systems become incredibly fragile when accountability becomes asymmetrical. And we all know this. Reciprocity matters. When one side feels perpetually scrutinized, while we keep the other one largely insulated from any type of feedback or corrective action, resentment becomes predictable. And that shift matters. And initially, there was a lot of anger. And anger is not bad. Remember, it's still engagement. But disillusionment, now that's exit behavior, and that is problematic. Now, with the narrative piece, narratives tend to keep engagement going for a prolonged period of time. But just like anything else, those narratives have a shelf life, because eventually, lived experience will override the narrative framing. Because when enough participants within the system realize that their efforts are not going to bring them the rewards that they expected it to, they don't necessarily outwardly protest, they quietly reduce investment. And that brings us to the most destabilizing variable in this system today, male withdrawal. Now, in my last video, I talked a lot about female behavior and how they regulate one another within this system. And today, I want to talk about the contrast when it comes to men. Men and women do not respond to environments in identical ways, as many people want you to believe that men and women are the exact same. They're not. Women, on average, are much more socially regulated. Men, on average, are much more incentive regulated. So when a system feels confusing or unstable, many men just run a very simple calculation. Is effort producing reward? Is investment producing an outcome? And under all that, is participation in this even rational? If the answer begins to feel uncertain, unlike women, men are not going to hold public conversations and discourse about it. They simply reallocate their effort. They work more, train more, pursue individual hobbies, and reduce exposure to high-risk, low-reward situations. Now, from the outside, this can look like avoidance, but from the inside, it's actually a very strategic adaptation. Men historically orient themselves within environments where the effort to reward ratio is relatively clear. Work has rules, fitness has rules, skill building has rules, but modern dating increasingly feels like it has none at all. So instead of protesting ambiguity, many simply reduce participation. Now, this doesn't mean that withdrawal is always healthy, but it is understandable in a system where the perceived effort to reward ratio is simply unclear. Now, women often maintain relational orientation even when they're frustrated, but men are much more likely to detach entirely if a domain feels low in return. When women become dissatisfied, they talk more. When men become dissatisfied, they often stop talking and quietly disengage. Now, this creates a perceptual gap. All the public discourse around this assumes that men continue to remain highly engaged. Meanwhile, a growing number have psychologically stepped back. And because male disengagement is so quiet, it's underestimated until it starts to impact outcomes at scale. Again, systems don't destabilize because people are unhappy. Of course, there are unhappy people in a system, but they do destabilize when participation declines drastically. Now, this doesn't suggest that men are some victims of a larger scheme. What it does mean is that they are responding appropriately to low return, high risk incentives. When these dynamics happen for men in their minds, they don't sit here and moralize the whole thing. They exit. And withdrawal is no different. It's a strategic adaptation, but it carries consequences. Men who withdraw way too deeply, they lose relational skill development and they risk isolation, which makes it much more difficult to reintegrate later on. So the real question isn't whether or not withdrawal is justified. The real question is, under what conditions would make healthy men willing to reinvest? Because unlike women, when things are uncertain, social pressure isn't going to bring them back. There has to be a tangible reward for the risk and the effort that they are putting in, which right now, and I'm not going to speak for all men, but I'm going to assume none of them, or the majority of them, are not experiencing. Now, if you're like me and you like to observe systems from the 10,000-foot view, then eventually you come to the question of who is benefiting from this dynamic. If trust is declining, if loneliness is rising, if relationships are forming way less frequently, why does the broader ecosystem surrounding modern dating continue to operate exactly as it is? When negative outcomes persist across large populations of people and nothing meaningful corrects course, the instability itself might be serving some other means, economic or structural incentives, not as a cartoon conspiracy, but as alignment of incentive. Modern economies, nowadays, in 2026, they run on attention, consumption, and psychological activation. And few psychological states drive engagement more reliably than dissatisfaction and uncertainty. Stable, fulfilled, happy people, well, they consume less content. They scroll less, they search less, and they are much harder to monetize emotionally. Meanwhile, uncertain individuals keep searching, they keep swiping, they keep consuming advice, or validation, or identity reinforcement. The attention economy, it rewards activation. Outrage, fear, and moral conflict perform much better than calm stability. Gender war, dialogue, and content, well, that continues to perform because it paints a picture of one clear villain: the opponent. These are simple villains and simple narratives. And those narratives, well, they keep people engaged. And the engagement, well, it sustains the platform. Dating applications, by design, operate on engagement and subscriptions. Prolonged searching is not inherently a failure of the system. It's often aligned with its engagement model. One really important psychological concept, and we see this a lot in toxic relationships, but intermittent rewards, or the use of intermittent rewards, keeps users much more invested for longer periods of time than predictable outcomes. On top of that, we have celebrity culture and social media further inflating these norms. Men continue to compare themselves or be compared to these high status male archetypes, and women compare themselves to these highly curated, molded lifestyles and highly selective partner portrayals. And as a consequence to all this, what happens? The expectation baseline raises well beyond statistical reality. And when expectations inflate much higher than real-world outcomes, dissatisfaction becomes inevitable. Add to this a cultural environment where therapeutic language and moral language is often used to categorize ordinary conflict. A disagreement, now it's a pathology. Incompatibility, a moral failure, and a system that moralizes everything will lose its ability to self-correct. So if you want the responsible version of a conspiratorial insight, it's this. Not that a secret group is organizing some relational instability and decline, though possible, but that multiple powerful industries and cultural systems benefit from this dynamic. Sustained dissatisfaction, constant searching, and emotional activation. Meanwhile, when incentives converge, predictable outcomes, well, they start to emerge, even without coordination. So now the question becomes, if this stays consistent, if this continues to amplify, what are the long-term consequences? What is the trajectory of all of this? Well, there are several trends that are likely to intensify. The polarization will deepen, more men will adopt withdrawal strategies, and more women will adopt hyperselectivity and hypervigilance, while the cooperative middle, the majority who are indeed seeking stable partnership, they'll likely grow quieter because the extremes will dominate perception, and you guys see this in other domains of our reality. On top of that, pair bonding will become much more unequal, with a very small subset of people successfully achieving that, while the majority remain in prolonged ambiguity. Family formation will continue to delay later and later and later, and this will ultimately increase fertility pressure, fertility issues, declining birth rates, and much more social and relational anxiety, frustration, and disappointment. Loneliness, as a consequence, increasingly becomes more of a risk of an identity than a temporary state of development. And once identity forms around withdrawal and mistrust, the reverse of that behavior becomes incredibly difficult. Perhaps, to me, most concerning and the biggest issue I see today with people who are indeed pursuing relationships and trying is that relational skill development has declined and will continue to decline across generations. Fewer people practicing negotiation, cooperation, compromise, respectful dialogue, and this ultimately drives weaker relational capacity, even for those who truly want that outcome. And at that point, you no longer have a dating problem. You have a true cultural fracture. So now you might be wondering, are there any solutions to this? And I'm going to speak to men and women directly. For men, the solution is not resentment. The solution is accuracy and discernment. Most men were implicitly sold a false contract. Be good, do good, and the system will reward you. Now, goodness is a baseline requirement for a relationship, but what it is not is a selection strategy, because selection happens much further in advance than a moral evaluation, aka attraction precedes discernment. So for the men who do want a stable long-term partnership, you must develop clarity, direction, and most importantly, boundaries. Not arrogance or manipulation, but calm leadership, standards, and competence. Now, I must add that reducing your exposure to algorithmic dating is likely a bonus. Not necessarily because technology is inherently harmless, but because the majority of social media environments, well, they prioritize short-term attraction and attention, much more than long-term compatibility. I would also encourage men to reestablish social connections and community, professional networks, shared missions, fitness, faith, social circles, because this reintroduces social context and reputation into selection. This very much also helps decenter your romantic partner from being your whole world and source of self-esteem and or connection. Now, when you do see somebody that you might be interested in, things that I really would encourage men to keep very top of mind. Number one, screen for low chaos traits. This becomes critical. Emotional regulation, humility, cooperativeness, and moral consistency. This matters much more for long-term stability over short-term attraction, and we cannot rely on chemistry alone. Now, if you are in the demographic of men who feels the need to withdraw, I'm not here to tell you what to do, but I would encourage this to be strategic and temporary. Use this to build yourself, structure, discipline, purpose, direction. Do not use this simply as a means of avoidance. And please, please remember that male friendships and support, these are not optional luxuries, okay? They are stabilizers. Now, for the women, I say this because I care. A system cannot stay stable or create stability if one side is endlessly scrutinized while the other is shielded from honest feedback. Female peer culture, it matters. Norms around attention, commitment, and conflict shape outcomes. If we continue to prioritize and reward endless optionality, ambiguity, promiscuity, and performative independence, those norms will shape relational behaviors. Again, this is not about blame. this is about feedback, because healthy relationships require reciprocal accountability, clear standards and norms around commitment and respect, way less reliance on algorithmic searches, optionality, and backup plans, and a much greater tolerance for disagreement without the moral pathologizing, and a cultural reevaluation of long-term orientation as a marker of maturity rather than a limitation. Because the reality is people still want love, but love does not sustain itself in a system that rewards instability. Because the truth is, dating, its efforts, people in the system will still continue to pursue that. It will sustain. But the more important question is whether or not it will continue in its same form, because the system responds much more to behavior than ideology. And if enough participants simply disengage, well, then the system is forced to adapt or reorganize. So if you're a man watching this, the goal is very simple. Don't become bitter. Don't become naive. Build discernment and become more accurate in your selection. And if you are somebody who is withdrawn right now and feels no reason to engage in all of this, I understand. But don't waste your life hating women. Build your life so that it is structured enough that if and when a good woman appears, you can recognize her and build something stable. Because the alternative is to continue to participate in a system that most people don't actually believe in anymore, and then acting surprised when instability becomes the norm. Now, if you liked this video, then I think you'll like this one too. And if not, then respectfully, fuck off.